Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to yet another PLUS webinar. My name is Katlego Ramantsima, and I am a researcher at PLUS. I will be facilitating this afternoon session. PLUS turned 25 years this month, and as part of celebrating our milestone, we are bringing back the land debate and affirming its relevance in the midst of the pandemic. Land reform is a long-standing unresolved question in South Africa, and with the COVID-19 pandemic ongoing, there seems to be a lot of silence from government about the way forward. Yet, this is an aspect of our economy that has the potential to play a significant role in reducing the vulnerability and food insecurity for rural populations. Today, we'll be discussing beyond elite capture, promoting livelihoods and jobs in South Africa's land reform. To lead us on this discussion, we have Dr. Farah Ntero, who is a senior researcher and lead researcher in land reform here at PLUS. And also, we're being joined by our emeritus professor and founder of PLUS, Ben Cousins. Please follow the conversation on Twitter by tagging us at PLUS UWC. Our Twitter handle is Land Reform. Is hashtag Land Reform and hashtag Beyond Elite Capture, as demonstrated on the bottom of your screens. So without wasting any more time, Farai, you may kick us off with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katlego, for the introduction. Greetings, everyone. I'm going to talk about elite capture in land redistribution in South Africa. As Katlego has mentioned, there has been less focus on land reform in the last couple of months since the COVID-19 crisis started, and that has been followed by a significant budget cut that has far-reaching implications, especially for a pro-poor land reform program in South Africa. But also that happens against the backdrop of a perennially low land reform budget, which has persistently been below 1% of the national total budget. But I will argue in my discussion that land reform in South Africa remains relevant. And when I'm talking about land reform, I'm specifically referring to a pro-poor land reform that promotes livelihoods and promotes food production amongst the poor. So in many ways, at the heart of my argument is the point that the right to land and the right to food are integrally linked. They are inseparable, they are interconnected. So what has been the overall trajectory of land reform in South Africa? My key argument in this discussion is that land reform has increasingly become pro-elite and anti-poor. I think the best starting point of departure when discussing land reform is to look at the Constitution. South Africa's land reform is entrenched in the Constitution, and I will specifically highlight Section 25, subsection 5 of the Bill of Rights, which addresses the land redistribution component of land reform in South Africa. And the most important thing to note is that this provision, this constitutional provision, directs the state to broaden opportunities for people to derive benefits from land. And in many ways, those opportunities naturally include the right to produce food, for people to produce their own food. So you can see that I'm juxtaposing the right to land and the right to food to emphasize that interconnection that I've mentioned earlier on. So what are the implications of this constitutional provision? So there are some key questions that arise when we look at Section 25, subsection 5 of the Bill of Rights. The first important question is, has the government been able to broaden access to land to provide more opportunities in land reform? And if so, to what extent? Who should benefit from these opportunities? What are the processes for their selection? What benefits should accrue to them? And these are very key questions which can only be resolved through relevant legislation and effective land reform policies. And the primary law governing land reform in South Africa the Land Reform Provision of Land and Assistance Act 126 of 1993, simply referred to as Act 126, has been proven to be very inadequate when it comes to ensuring adequate access to land in South Africa. Some of the key problematic areas, I won't go through all the points, is that there are wide discretionary powers that are afforded to the administrative authorities in determining the allocation of resources. In other words, there's no formula to apportion the distribution of resources in terms of which groups get how much in terms of resource allocation. So now I will just highlight the research that my colleagues and myself did. We looked at the proactive land acquisition strategy and went to 5 provinces, gathered data on 62 land reform projects across the country. And these are some of the key questions that we surfaced during our research. And in many ways, they speak to the issue of equitable access to land and the ways in which we address the ways in which land reform has shifted from being pro-poor to being pro-elite. So one of the primary questions is who has been benefiting from land redistribution in South Africa? Who are the winners and who are the losers? So this is just to show you the areas that we visited, the 5 provinces, that is the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Free State, Northwest, the Western Cape. So the key question is, what is elite capture? When we talk about elite capture in land reform, what are we talking about? And how does elite capture in land reform actually unfold? Elite capture simply refers to the concentration of public resources in the hands of a few individuals, and usually is the economically powerful and the politically influential individuals. So instead of broadening access to land and reconfiguring the unequal agrarian structure, a select group of black commercial farmers is promoted in land reform. So we adapted some typologies for analyzing changes that happen when land reform has been implemented. Ian Schoons and his colleagues used a typology to try and map out the different patterns of accumulation that happen post-land reform. And we grouped those land reform projects, the 62 land reform projects that I referred to, into these categories. So there's the dropping out category that you see there. Those are people who have basically, the farms have dropped out of production as a result of a number of constraints, mainly the lack of production support, poor infrastructure, run down farmhouses, and in some instances, powerful people intercept resources so that they don't reach the rightful beneficiaries. And also the issue of weak tenure rights, unclear and contested tenure rights affected production and resulted in the collapse of production, basically. So some of those beneficiaries have abandoned the farms and moved elsewhere to seek alternative livelihoods. There are those who are still hanging in. That's the 16% that you see there. And these are farmers who are just really maintaining a foothold on the farm. They still lack resources, just like the first category, those who are dropping out. They do not have machinery, they do not have equipment, they have unclear land rights as well. And also some elites and powerful individuals in those communities have intercepted resources, diverted resources, such that that has resulted in non-accumulation. So there are those who are stepping up through reinvestment. That's only 19%. And this group of farmers, it's actually people who are relatively poor, who mobilize their own resources, invest in farming, and whenever they make small profits, they reinvest those profits into the farming enterprise. And in many ways, this is gradual accumulation from bottom up. And then there are those who are stepping in diversifying. So the group that is stepping in, that 44% that I've circled there, it's actually affluent business people in the middle classes from the urban areas. We have substantial sources of income, but we have qualified who have become farm beneficiaries, they bring in a lot of resources, substantial amount of resources. And you can see that they're involved in many business activities. They are traders, they are rural transport operators, and some of them are in state procurement, for instance. So that's the 44%. The 11% is actually that group of people who do not have any resources. They are not in business, but the only advantage they have is that they are politically connected, they have influence, and they use those networks to access resources. So I'm going to take you through the different ways in which elite capture actually happens, the different strategies, the different practices which result in the concentration of resources, as I have said, in the hands of a few powerful individuals, politically influential, economically powerful, just to emphasize that. So elite capture is usually happens when there are special projects that are just established that are used then to divert resources. And usually those are non-land reform projects. They have nothing absolutely to do with land reform. There is the imposition of politically connected beneficiaries. There is the bailing out of politically connected elites who have accumulated debt and in their farming enterprises. There's the withholding of leases, there's fronting, there's also the exerting of political pressure on lower level officials so that they comply and flout departmental regulations. But also agribusinesses are heavily involved in elite capture. Some of the patterns that we identified included farm flipping, where an agribusiness enterprise buys a farm at an exorbitant price and then at a very low price, and then resells that same farm to the state at a very higher price. There's also the imposition of strategic partners. There's transfer pricing, where produce from the farm is acquired at a very low price by a strategic partner who is also involved in that farming project. And then they sell it at a very higher price and capture the profits. The supply of inputs at very high prices is one of the patterns that we identified. There is the failure to declare dividends. A project could be running for a couple of years, but in all that time, there are no dividends that are declared, meaning that the profits are simply reinvested into the farming enterprise to accumulate more surplus without improving the livelihoods of beneficiaries who are supposed to benefit and enhance their welfare. There's also asset stripping, the removal of assets on a farm, such that those assets are used elsewhere at a farm that also belongs maybe to the strategic partners, or also renting out that equipment to other farmers. So those are just the patterns that we identified. So I would like to talk about the significance of these accumulation patterns. What does it all mean for land reform in South Africa? Why are we talking about these patterns of accumulation? So the idea of bringing in capital from outside of agriculture is a well-established pattern. Politicians, civil servants, affluent professionals have increasingly become more involved in agriculture. Across the continent, the middle class is moving into agriculture, diversifying their sources of income. This has been widely documented by other researchers, and there is an element of that here in land reform in South Africa. But of concern is the concentration of public resources in the hands of a few black commercial farmers, instead of making the agrarian structure more equitable, broad, and inclusive. So it's about apportioning resources in an equitable manner so that the historically disadvantaged groups, the marginalized, women, the youth, farm workers, farm dwellers, for instance, can also benefit from land reform in South Africa. So the accumulation that we see is not based on the inclusion of the smallholder farmers. There are approximately 2.5 million small-scale farmers that are mostly confined to the former homelands. Out of that 2.5 million small-scale farmers, there is about 250,000 small-scale farmers who are actually producing surplus, marketing surplus produce, very productive and very dynamic. But the rest is involved in agriculture and producing only enough for household consumption. So I would just like to conclude by saying large-scale commercial farmers are a key part of South Africa's agrarian structure. But what is problematic at the moment is the exclusive promotion of the large-scale farming model in land reform in South Africa, while neglecting other historically disadvantaged groups. Colleagues, I will end my discussion here, and over to you, Katlego. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Farai, for that incredibly insightful presentation, which gave us a perfect picture of the past and current land status in South Africa. I will now hand over to Professor Ben Cousins to share insights on his recent published research, which looks at the potential contribution of redistributive land reform to employment. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Katlego. I'm going to report the findings of a 9-month study on the potential for employment creation through land redistribution. It follows nicely on from Farai's presentation, in that what we have explored here is the potential for a more broad-based program to address the problem of unemployment. As Farai has mentioned, food security is a massive issue in South Africa now. Everybody recognizes this. But another major issue, another major challenge facing us is unemployment. It is anticipated that the already very high levels of unemployment may increase dramatically as a result, well, are already increasing dramatically as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So this question of how can we create employment opportunities, including through land reform, is a key policy issue facing our country. And despite the budget cuts, I think we have to go on debating how to achieve employment. So this project was commissioned by the Government Technical Advice Committee through their capacity building program for employment promotion and funded by the European Union. It was a 9-month investigation starting in September 2019 and ending in April this year. And it explored not only the potential for employment, but also the policies, programs, and capacities which government should focus on in order to achieve growth in employment. Next slide, please. So, as I said, unemployment is a key problem. The key questions are, can redistributive land reform be undertaken in a manner that creates jobs? And if so, through which mixes of commodities and what kinds of farming systems? At what scales? Another key question is there a role for small-scale, market-oriented farming systems? And if there is potential for employment creation, what kinds of policy frameworks are required? Now, what I'd just like to emphasize here is that we are not, in this project, we were not trying to address all the problems of land reform. In fact, we were focusing very narrowly on the potential for employment creation, specifically through a focus on small-scale, market-oriented farming systems, both smallholder farmers and small-scale commercial farmers, as a particular focus. So what approach did we take? We engaged in a number of reviews of different commodities, livestock, wool production, vegetables, subtropical fruit and nuts, and sugarcane. We undertook thematic studies of land tenure, support services, value chains, financing mechanisms, sociocultural factors. We focused quite a lot on climate change and the implications for land reform, and we had a paper on lessons from international experience. The key part of this project, the heart of the project, was really that final component, primary data collected in 4 local municipalities in different parts of the country. Sakisizwe, a local municipality in the Eastern Cape, Inkosi Langalibelele in KwaZulu-Natal, Greater Tsenin in Limpopo, and Matsakama in Western Cape. There's a great variety of agroecological conditions and a great variety of different products being produced, and the importance of small-scale and smallholder production varies across the country. So we're going to do a relatively in-depth investigation and then explore the wider implications. Next slide, please, Farai. The study was informed by a number of assumptions which are important to spell out so that the results can be interpreted appropriately. By employment, we include employment by others and self-employment. So a farmer and a certain number of family members who are self-employed are included in our estimates. We just estimated a rather conservative figure of 0.3 family members per farming unit. Our estimates are for full-time equivalents, in other words, work for 264 days a year. So, and these are net jobs. In other words, we are accounting for the jobs placed by the arrival of new beneficiaries of land reform. As an arbitrary assumption, we assume that 50% of commercial farmland would be redistributed to small-scale black farmers. That's not a target, that's simply in order to show the degree of magnitude of job creation. It might be more, it might be less. We also estimated some costs to the state, basically that of land acquisition and some establishment or setup costs for the different commodities. With respect to livestock production, we assumed that farmers would bring some of their own livestock onto the farm at about 50% of the carrying capacity of that land area. And we assumed land prices equivalent to the average market price in the area. In other words, we were not really considering expropriation. So those were our background assumptions. We identified 3 ways in which labor-intensive, employment-intensive farming systems could be achieved through land reform. Firstly, through reducing the size of farming units and thus increasing the total numbers of those farming units. So a 10,000 hectare farm might be able to create, say, 20 or 25 smaller scale farms. So that's one way to do it. The second way is to change the mix of commodities produced as well as the scale of those commodities. So there might be a move from, say, cattle to sheep or goat production, might be more vegetables produced, might be more fruit and nut commodities produced. These also produce greater levels of employment. And thirdly, we estimated that changing farming systems so that they become more labor intensive, more employment intensive is another way. So, for example, you're employing people to weed your crops rather than spray on herbicides, you can in fact end up employing more people. We also assumed, however, in our estimates that the new farming operations would be as productive and as profitable as the existing operations, although, of course, through slightly different farming systems. So the big headline finding that in these 4 local municipalities, we estimated a total of around 23,600 net new jobs could be created through redistributive land reform. Next slide. So I won't go through all these slides in detail. You can come back to them in question time. But just to give you the headline findings, in KwaZulu-Natal, in Nkosi Silangelele local municipality, mainly extensive livestock production, a little bit of vegetable production, livestock mainly in goats, which are more labor intensive than other forms of livestock. Total new jobs which could be created, about 2,200 at a cost of 325,000 per job. Next slide. In Greater Tsenin, in Limpopo, where high-value subtropical fruit, nuts, and vegetables can be produced, and all of those being labor-intensive, we estimated the total new jobs which could be created through redistributing 50% of farms, commercial farms, would be around 17,000 at an overall cost per job of 418,000. Next slide. In Matsakama local municipality in the Western Cape, where high-value crops such as grapes and vegetables and lucerne are grown along the Olifants River on irrigated land, we estimated that about 3,198 new jobs at a higher cost of 685,000 Rand per job because of the higher price of land in the area. Next slide. And finally, we have Sakisizwe local municipality in the Eastern Cape. small area on vegetables, maize, and wool production, a total number of new jobs, new net jobs, 1,069, and an overall cost per job of 426,000. Just to say, these might look to you as though they're quite high costs per job, but in fact, the main cost is the acquisition of land, which of course is a productive asset, which remains in the hands of beneficiaries. And I think actually these are not very high costs if we compare them to the costs of new investment in industry, for example. Next slide. So I'm not going to report on all of these, but our final report makes a number of recommendations for how to go about achieving this kind of employment-intensive land redistribution. Firstly, the selection of beneficiaries and matching them with opportunities is absolutely key. And as Farai's presentation pointed out, what's key here is to move away from the relatively wealthy and elite to those smallholder-based farmers using mainly family labor and the small-scale commercial farmers who are going to invest in farming itself. This is key. We also engaged very intensively with the implications of climate change, a number of recommendations there. We focused on how to create appropriately scaled farming units and secure their land rights. We looked at support services in some depth. We engaged with the question of institutional frameworks and capacity building, and we looked at a number of complementary policy reforms such as water allocation reform and local governments supporting informal agricultural markets. Next slide. So on all of those, we can take questions of detail if you're interested. And finally, just to say, identifying appropriate beneficiaries and matching them to opportunities is absolutely at the heart of successful redistributive land reform. So here we say that it is vital to acknowledge the realities of small-scale farmers. Often they are part-time farmers, often they're embedded in local markets, they are highly diverse, and their circumstances are changing. These are realities which we need to acknowledge, and they're very different to those of very large-scale commercial farmers, the farmers who dominate our agricultural system at the moment. Secondly, in our view, the largest number of appropriate beneficiaries for redistribution are employment-intensive smallholder farmers, but also small-scale commercial farmers. And we identify a range of opportunities for them. Especially promising commodities include extensive livestock production, remembering that South Africa is a dry country and most land is suitable only for livestock. But of course, where there's some irrigation water, you can engage in intensive production of vegetables and fruit as well. So small-scale vegetable production seems to have a great deal of potential. We also recommend that mixed farming systems be planned for, and that mixed marketing strategies, in other words, not supplying only the formal market, but also including the informal market, are important. In our recommendations on local institutional frameworks, we suggest a strong focus on local planning with and through local municipalities and other government departments, looking carefully at local agricultural potential, market potential, as well as the existing small-scale farming systems and the land needs of the population. Is there another slide? So our conclusions are that despite how specific our 4 local municipality case studies are, we think that there are lessons from these cases which we can generalize about along the following lines. Real gains in employment intensity are possible through land reform. The underlying principles and practices are familiar to us, but they need to be applied by government in a very deliberate manner. And we finally end up recommending the launch of a small number of pilot programs across the country to investigate the policies that we recommend and to develop new standards of best practice. And we hope that government will be responding positively to this recommendation. So I just want to say here that this has been a focus on the economic dimensions of land reform. And of course, land reform and land redistribution set out to achieve a much larger set of objectives, not only the economic. So I'm stressing the economic because of the focus of our project, but of course we recognize that there are a wide range of other reasons for undergoing land reform, including justice, including the need for dignity, including recognizing land as a source of identity and belonging. But in our view, the economic dimensions are critical, are important. And given the massive increase in unemployment as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, we think that land reform, rather than getting a budget cut, should proceed at speed with a key focus on employment creation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for your presentation. I guess right now we will be taking questions and comments. Please do follow the conversation on Twitter by tagging @+UWC. Our Twitter handle is #LandReform and beyond elite capture, as demonstrated on the bottom of your screens. We will take the first question now. Alison Moultrie asks, great that your research focused on climate change. Did you consider the impact of commercial farming itself on climate change and loss of biodiversity? I think that question is directed to you, Ben.
Not specifically. In our commission paper on climate change, we asked researchers to specifically examine the implications for small-scale farmers, and water harvesting as a key technique was part of that. It was recommended strongly in that paper. However, in our field investigations, we did not have time to investigate the detail of how such alternative systems of water harvesting might work. So it's mentioned in passing, but not investigated in depth.
Thank you very much, Ben. Can we have our second question, please? Muhammad asks, okay. He actually says, I may have missed one big issue here. Why are small subdivisions being encouraged? That's a question for you, Farai.
Thank you, Katleho. Thank you for the question, Mohammed. If you look at Act 126, it actually empowers the administrative authority, the minister, to implement subdivision where necessary to accommodate small-scale farming, for instance. But we don't see a lot of that happening. Subdivision is actually not taking place, even when it's necessary, even when it's clear that it could possibly promote small-scale farming land needs that are not necessarily linked to large-scale commercial farming. So that would be my response. It's actually not happening. It should be happening where it's necessary and needed.
Thank you very much, Farai, for that. May we also have another question? Because I can see Ruth Hall asked, cost per job depends on land cost, which is a political choice. What would cost per job look like excluding land price? Ben or Farai, who wants to take that one on?
I think she's I think Ruth is asking me that question because we specifically calculated the cost per job in terms of land as compared to the setup costs. Looking at my table, which I haven't shown you here, we can see that the land cost comprises about 2/3 to 3/4 of those total costs. So that's assuming, as I said, that the government is bearing the setup costs of establishing those commodities, although livestock owners are bringing their own livestock in to at least 50% of the herd. So I think if we took out the land cost, for example, in Nkosi Langalibalele, the setup cost per job would be about 58,000 rand as compared to 267,000 per job if land is included. So in that case, it's about 28% of the former figure. So generally speaking, costs are much lower if you don't include that land cost.
Thank you very much, Ben. Next question, please. Mike Kenyon asks, the objective is great, but without a capable state, how is where this breaks down? Okay, I'm not very clear on this question. I think he's trying to say that, I think this is what he's trying to say, that we do need a capable state in order for us to be able to steer a successful land reform. Next question or comment, please. Alison asks again, was there any particular consideration of job creation for current or previous farm workers who have been or are at a risk of being kicked off farms? I think this one is for you, Farai.
The thing is, when farms are transferred, I will just address this question first. The lag time between acquiring the farm, remember, with the proactive land acquisition strategy, the state actually buys farms directly from the landowners instead of allocating grants to individuals or groups so that they purchase their own land. So that process tends to be protracted, it takes long. And when there are caretakership arrangements for people to look after the farm while the process of acquisition is being finalized and the right beneficiaries are yet to be identified, that causes production to collapse. And once production collapses and the farm is not productive, the equipment is lying idle, that does significantly affect employment. So usually because of those kind of challenges, by the time the farm is acquired, there would have been job losses. But besides job losses, most of the farms acquired are targeted at well-off, prosperous people with resources, with the means to engage in farming. And what that means is that you are acquiring a huge tract of land that will be allocated to a single individual, as opposed to being subdivided and allocated to a large number of people, and in that sense, creating employment opportunities, livelihood opportunities for a fairly large number of people. So within land reform, that's the limitation why we don't see a lot of jobs being created through the transfer of land at the moment, looking at the kind of land reform that we see.
Thank you very much, Farai. Another question is from Mafani Sohara, and he asks, does government provide extension services to these small-scale farmers? I believe commercial farmers buy private extension services. Could this be true? Does the government provide extension services for small-scale farmers? Farai?
Shall I take that one?
Okay, sure.
Government employs many thousands of extension workers who are supposed to provide extension services to both small and large-scale farmers. The extension service is not very efficient at the moment, and there have been many recommendations in recent years on how to improve this. There's a program called Renewal of Extension Services. And in our report, we make a number of recommendations about how extension could support redistributive land reform in a manner which is employment intensive, which includes a methodology called Know Your Farmer, taking the specific features, characteristics, needs and opportunities of small-scale and smallholder farmers into account. So I think the private sector, large commercial farmers, may be purchasing extension services from agribusiness companies, not relying very much on government extension staff. Government extension staff should be servicing land reform beneficiaries, but they're not doing that very effectively at the moment. However, there's great potential for recharging extension services in South Africa. But what it requires is a strong political commitment. And the real question is the one that Mike Kenyon is asking. Not only does the government have capacity to undertake this, but does it have the political will to do so? I think the jury is still out on this. If we see the ANC's recent economic policy document, it basically doesn't say anything very much. It goes back to the 2013 National Development Plan proposals, which are way out of date, which are very problematic to begin with. We actually need new thinking in land reform, informed by the high-level panel of Parliament and the Presidential Advisory Panel. And it seems as though the ANC has not taken those into account. So questions of political will are key here.
Thank you very much, Ben. It seems like the conversation is that we need state capacity and a political will and more in for us to steer this land reform project forward. I will be taking more questions in the 7 minutes that we have. And our next question is from Ngiseni Buthelezi, and he asks, are the recommendations of this project going to be taken forward by concerned departments, or is it meant to be just a thinking exercise? I think this is for this question is for the both of you. What are the plans with regards to your findings?
Yeah.
Who wants to go first?
Okay, thank you, Kahle. The research we see from the outset, we have been engaging with policymakers, with different role players in the land sector, from civil society, state actors, policymakers who implement policies and design policies. Throughout since 2018, where we have been surfacing these findings in meetings and discussions and trying to influence and to engage in a constructive and inclusive way with different people who are concerned. So definitely the research is meant to bring about the desired change. And I think those processes take time. It's about creating those spaces, and that's what we are doing.
And Ben?
By a unit of Treasury, this arose out of the Job Summit initiative last year. And there is interest in the ongoing Job Summit process centered around NEDLAC. And they may, in fact, be funding a pilot project in Matsikama. There's some interest in that. When our study got underway, the minister was briefed, and we attempted to have senior officials, DGs or DDGs, on the project reference committee. 2 of them came to one meeting. But unfortunately, thereafter, there's been very little active interest from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. We're still hoping to brief senior officials, but it's not clear why they're not expressing interest at the moment. So once again, I think it's partly a matter of political will.
Thank you very much, Ben. Can we have the next question, as we have a few, and I'm going to try and take as many questions as we can. There's another question from Stayeni, and she asks, could you please comment on the nature of jobs in relation to 1, working conditions, 2, permanent versus casual, and 3, salaries? I think she might be posing a question to the both of you. with regards to your findings on the nature of jobs that you saw in the Elite Capture project, and also to you, Ben, the nature of jobs that might be created. Ben, would you like to go first?
Sorry, me. Okay, sure. What we assumed in our estimates is that these are full-time equivalent jobs, and that salaries are no lower than minimum wages at the moment. That's for the purpose of estimating potential. However, in reality, in a lot of small-scale farming systems, employment is not actually at the minimum wage. Small-scale farmers tend to pay below the minimum wage. In terms of farming, often it's not full-time farming. There are other sources of income. And sometimes farm workers are even paid in kind. So the reality is that there is a little bit of a trade-off between the number of jobs and the conditions of employment. I think it's better to be upfront about that trade-off and to say we aspire to give workers decent jobs with proper living wages, but that under small-scale farming systems, it's going to be difficult to achieve that, certainly in the short term. Yeah, I would also add, however, that in terms of there's great potential in this country to promote small-scale livestock farming systems, which, as I said, most of the agroecology of the country supports. And although the returns to those kinds of jobs may not be very high, both in terms of profits and in terms of conditions of employment, I think there's undoubtedly potential for increasing employment intensity. With regards to vegetables, it's labor intensive. Often, again, the returns are not high, but the potential is there to employ large numbers of people. So I think we must, however, be frank about the fact that a redistributive land reform is not going to create a large number of high-paying jobs. I think that is a pipe dream.
Thank you, Ben. Farai?
I think we did explore the question of jobs in our research on elite capture. And as I've mentioned, we found that in most instances, there was a general decline in employment on the farms. And to be fair, there were some farms that were fairly prosperous, that were doing well, that still retained the same number of employees after land reform, after settling on the farm, and still maintained relatively good standards of living for their employees, good working conditions, good wages. But in many instances, we saw a lot of job losses, people who had been employed because the farm did not access sufficient production support, because there was a delay in the transfer of the farm, and to resuscitate production, it becomes costly, and that comes naturally with a lot of job losses. So those are the kind of patterns that we saw in our research. But also we have a paper in the pipeline that explores that in more detail, the question of jobs and the question of farm workers within land reform, drawing on our broader research on elite capture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Farai. Can we get our next question? And the next question is from Siphe Sihle Nguka. And Siphe Sihle states, my question relates to how the majority of people who benefit from the state land lease disposal policy are well-off men. What would you say is the reason for this? Could it be as a result of a flawed selection criteria? I think that question is directly for you, Farai.
Thank you, Katlego. Thank you, Siphe Sihle. Our research confirms the findings nationally that women are generally underrepresented in land reform. Only 23% of women have benefited in land redistribution since the program started. And the number could actually be lower than that, though those are the existing estimates. That's the information we have so far. But from our own research, only 19% of the beneficiaries, farm beneficiaries, are women. And it starts with the stringent conditions, the selection criteria, as you mentioned, that in some instances it was not uniform across provinces. You have to have a certain number of cattle to demonstrate that you already have resources to be a successful commercial farmer before you can be allocated a farm. And that readily leaves out women from the outset. It doesn't give them a chance to go through the selection processes. There were a few women in our study, that 19%. So that's a challenge. And currently there's the National Land Allocation and Beneficiary Selection Policy that is in the pipeline. And I think it is some of those things that should be explored, how to create quotas for women in land reform. For instance, there are proposals to ensure that 50% of the land reform beneficiaries are women, for instance, but also that 50% of public resources in land reform should be allocated to women. So if that is considered, I think that could change things for the better.
Okay, thank you very much, Virai. Another question before we wrap up. There's a question from Boa Munjane, and he says, as I understand, you use the household as a unit of analysis, which is fine, but are there any attempts or experiences of articulated collective action among those small-scale farmers? Ben?
Yes, we did find several examples of farmer associations, including livestock associations, where farmers are coming together in order to engage in collective action, often with regard to a shared resource like a dip tank or whatever. But we also find that in the subtropical fruit industry, there's a study group offered by the Subtropical Fruit Producers Association, which brings together 1,000 small-scale farmers producing macadamia nuts and mangoes in Vembe district in Limpopo, encouraging results from that. Wool producers in the Eastern Cape are often gathered together around shearing sheds. So collective action is a key feature of the small-scale farming landscape. In regard to the question of subdivision, does it necessarily lead to productivity increases? Not necessarily, but potentially it does. So again, we get to the question of appropriate support, extension, and so on. I don't think any of these increases are inevitable. It's partly a matter of appropriate targeting, appropriate support, appropriate financing. Can we avoid debt? I think small-scale farming systems are less capital intensive. Therefore, they're likely to lead to lower borrowing costs. That's not quite so true in regards to some crops like subtropical fruit. It's very much the case with regards to livestock, and with regards to vegetable production, there's certainly the possibility of using fewer tractors and, in other words, incurring less debt. So I think we have to get real about the potential strengths, but they're only potentials. We have to engage in appropriate targeting and appropriate support, as well as acquiring land and redistributing it at scale.
Thank you very much, Ben. I guess that sums up our webinar for today. But from you, Farah, are there any last words in these few minutes that we have before we log off?
Thank you, Katlego. Just to conclude, I think what is needed is to understand the link, what I emphasized in my introduction, that the current crisis that we are facing, the COVID-19 crisis, it has a lot, it has affected food supplies. There's a lot of food hunger, food insecurity that is going on. But I think land reform is a key part of the solutions. Redistributing land and making it available to the small-scale farmers, for instance. I mentioned the 2.5 million smallholder farmers who are confined to the former homelands. In the long term, that's a key part of the solution to the food crisis that, by the way, only intensified when COVID started. It's an otherwise long-standing crisis that we have has been unfolding across the years. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to the both of you for your excellent presentations. And thank you to all of you who have joined us from all over. I would also like to state that this conversation is still ongoing on Twitter. Please tag Plus at UWC, and our Twitter handle is Land Reform and Beyond Elite Capture. I also have to let you all know that the video will be available online, so please take time to like and share the video. Next week, we will not be doing our regular seminars on a Thursday. However, our next seminar will be on a Friday, the 24th of July from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. And that webinar will be looking at the struggles for African Commons, building an agenda for engaged scholarship. Some of the panelists will be Issa Shifji Kojo Amma from the University of Ghana, Professor Georgie Tsikata from the University of Ghana, and also Professor Muniba Isaacs from PLUS. Do join us next week. Thank you all for joining us for this exciting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.